Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Prime Minister Theresa May returns to work after her walking holiday this week, just as two leading cabinet ministers have declared the UK will need a transition period to help businesses adjust after Brexit. Liam Fox, the International Trade Secretary, and Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, made the declaration in a joint article for the Sunday Telegraph, intended to quash speculation that the cabinet is divided over how to implement Brexit and what will happen during the transitional period. The Prime Minister's summer holiday has been plagued by Tory rows over how Britain will leave the EU. Over the next 10 days, ministers will also publish papers on Britain's Brexit plans, covering the Irish border, the customs union, fisheries and agriculture. But does this joint article show a genuine platform for progress, or is it a PR stunt? Well, joining us now, Owen Jones, a columnist for The Guardian, who believes there is no unity within the Conservative Party, and Joanne Nadler, a political journalist and communications consultant who worked as a senior Conservative press officer during the John Major years. She thinks this was the right moment for Liam Fox and Philip Hammond to show unity. Thank you both very much for coming in. So, Joanne, what we are hearing from them is that there will be no staying on in the single market or the customs union by the back door, but there will be a transition period. Is this a position that the whole party can get behind?
I think so. I think it's a position the whole party has to get behind. To a certain extent, this is a PR move because we've heard so many noises off over the last few months. And so much squabbling that it's obscured the essential direction of travel towards leaving the single market and the customs union. It's been very important that these two ministers who represent different sides of that argument do come together at this point, partly to reassure their own party, but also to reassure the country and business specifically that they're going to work together to this end.
What do you think, Owen? Is this a position that Labour could get around?
Well, no sooner had they published that article in the Telegraph, a Tory minister, briefed to the Telegraph that the pact wouldn't last, and that Philip Hammond had contempt for Liam Fox. The Tory party is riven with division. They've spent the whole summer at each other's throats. You had a spectator party where David Davis called Boris Johnson a failure. Tory MPs threatening to kick each other in various sensitive pieces of anatomy, which I can't say on the morning on the BBC. You've had Philip Hammond repeatedly briefed against. You've got Anna Soubry now, a Tory Remain supporting backbencher, who's talking about leaving possibly the Conservative Party. It's a very divided party. I think the point I would make about these divisions, though, because it's easy for me, my own position is, I'm someone obviously who supports the Labour Party, so that's clear. It's easy for me to have partisan kind of schadenfreude, to enjoy the Tories ripping themselves to shreds. But the point Chris Patten, a senior Conservative, made is that the disastrous decisions of two Conservative Prime Ministers had left the country in a terrible mess. And already, because we had a referendum not in the national interest but to assuage the internal divisions of the Tory party, then we had a snap general election called to destroy the Labour Party, that these internal divisions within the Conservative Party have left this country a laughingstock in Europe. And that's my fear, that we don't have a united government, we have a Prime Minister without authority, and Brexit negotiations haven't even properly begun.
So, Joanne, what do you think about Anna Soubry coming forward and saying she would join a new party?
I think it's completely
Brexit?
Uncontroversial. I think we know that there are some people in the Conservative Party who passionately believed in the Remain side of the argument, and they're perfectly entitled to do so, and they're perfectly entitled to argue their case with principle as they're continuing to do. They do not represent more than a minority within the Conservative Party, and more importantly, and I think this is what Owen overlooks, they don't represent the majority in the country either. The majority voted to leave the European Union. An essential element of leaving the European Union is to leave the single market and the customs union so that Britain can be more competitive and forge a more successful economic future for itself, but also a more successful economy than we're seeing on the continent. And that's really the point.
It's not going to be difficult for MPs to force a position where the government doesn't come out completely, when there are enough numbers of MPs who want a position where we stay in the single market and the customs customs union.
But I think what has happened over the last few months is because of the squabbling, and some of the squabbling is over important points of policy, and some of it is personal, as Owen has indicated, is we've got distracted from what actually the government needs to do now, which is to make the case again, reiterate the case again. Remainers have been very effective, I think, in arguing their case again since the result, almost putting down the result, which 1 million British people voted for. The majority was a vote by 1 million British people. So we haven't been, I think, on the Leave side particularly clear as to what the advantages for Britain will be. We only have to look at the economic stasis on the continent to see that this could be a great, great thing for Britain.
I want to bring in our political correspondent Emma Vardy, because she joins us from Westminster. Emma, is this joint positioning by Liam Fox and Philip Hammond going to put a lid on everything? Is it a sign of a new unity?
Well, for now, yes. This is, of course, seen as an attempt to show that unity, because there's been so much speculation, squabbling, questions whilst Theresa May has been on holiday. So it is an attempt to bring together the two sides of the cabinet between Liam Fox, a Brexiteer, and Philip Hammond, who is seen to prefer a softer approach. So both of them came together to say that the government does not want to see a cliff edge when we leave the EU in March 2019. And they both came together to talk about this agreement for the need for a transitional deal, but said that it must be time limited. So as to whether it will end all the speculation, I expect there'll be some bubbling around for a while yet. But this is a moment of unity ahead of Theresa May returning from holiday this week. Of course, she's been away enjoying 3 weeks in Italy, but she is due back. We're not quite sure when, but sometime this week.
Thank you, Emma. And David Miliband has also been speaking this weekend. He has said there must be a vote on a Brexit deal to allow the country or Parliament, whoever was able to vote, to potentially reject Brexit and stay in the EU. The Labour position is all over the place too, isn't it?
Well, Labour's position is that it has to find a way of clearing up a mess caused by the Conservative Party. There was a decision by the Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron for partisan advancement to have a referendum. They waged a disastrous campaign and they lost. Now the country's in a bit of a mess.
But we are where we are, so what should Labour's policy
and just
be?
in response to that, you know, I campaigned for Remain, but I accept that we lost the referendum, and now the debate is what sort of Brexit you have. My fear is that if you start saying at this stage that the Brexit result needs to be overturned, then a lot of people who voted Leave will regard that as contemptuous, if you like, of their democratic decision, and lots of people who voted Remain at the moment accept the democratic decision and want to find the best possible way. And my fear with the David Miliband position is this. I actually think it is up for grabs whether we stay in a single market in the customs union. I would prefer that. I know there are problems there, because then the danger is we end up with the worst of both worlds, where we basically have to accept EU laws but we can't contribute to them. But if we crash out of the single market and the customs union, the economic damage could be very considerable and hurt people who voted Leave the most. But if you're now arguing either, and you get this on Twitter all the time, people saying it was only an advisory referendum, Parliament can somehow defy it, I think that would cause absolute uproar in the country, or to call for a second referendum at this point, only a year after the last referendum, before there's been a big backlash. I think lots of people will find that contemptuous of their democratic decision, and it also means those of us who want a soft Brexit basically will walk off the pitch and leave the hard Brexiteers to decide what sort of Brexit this country has, and I don't think that's a good thing.
David Miliband in his article said democracy did not end on the 23rd of June 2016. The referendum will be no excuse if the country is driven off a cliff. MPs are there to exercise judgment.
Well, I mean, it's kind of equivalent to a beleaguered Conservative MP at this point who may have lost his seat in what was a very poor election campaign earlier this year, saying, you know what, let's have another election now because we didn't do too well 2 or 3 months ago. I mean, the decision was taken. The real question now is what are the policies that are going to underpin our Brexit, the way we carry out our Brexit. And on that point, I think Owen and I can agree. There's been an awful lot of distraction because of sometimes personality clashes, but sometimes genuine issues over policy differences within the Conservative Party. What's happened this week, I think, is that these two ministers have come together to sort of say, look, we need to actually now pull together and give Theresa May her head. She's coming back this week. She is going to make a big policy statement. We're going to look at various different aspects of Brexit, like how we will now manage outside the customs union, what's going to happen with the border with inside Ireland, for instance. And those kind of policies, they need to be scrutinised.
Just on that, I mean, the danger with the Tory Brexit, which we're going to end up with at this rate, is not only are we going to crash out the single market, the customs union, we may end up with no deal whatsoever.
I don't see that will just quickly. Tory Brexit.
That will now. Well, it is. It is elements of Brexit. Your party are going to have to own this, I can assure you. But the truth is, we're going to end up, as things stand, with World Trade Organization rules, which will mean tariffs being imposed on our goods, which will cause potentially enormous damage to the British economy. Wages are already falling in this country all over again. The danger is with that sort of Brexit, that will hit the living standards often of people who voted to leave, incidentally, jobs and the businesses.
So we've got this compromise position outlined this weekend. Is it a position that you think, in spite of all the divisions that you're talking about, that in the end MPs could actually unite around?
Frankly, there's still a lot of detail within that position that could be delineated and hasn't yet been so. Yeah. But as a sort of statement of, come on guys, we need to pull together, it's significant and important in that regard. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to scrutinise the detail within that. I mean, how long will this transition period be? And more importantly, what's at the end of the transition period? It's fine to talk about transition period, but we haven't yet heard what the vision is for the end of the transition period.
The Tory infighting we've seen this summer is before the difficulties of the Brexit negotiations really come underway. That's why a Tory minister yesterday briefed the Telegraph that this pact was not going to last. And
that's a Tory minister who even put his name to it.
And that Philip Hammond, well, I mean, I don't think the Telegraph just invented it. I mean, you know, let's give them some respect. But the truth is, you know, Philip Hammond, David Davis, Liam Fox, Theresa May, they are all fundamentally in quite different places. Philip Hammond earlier in the summer was arguing for a soft Brexit and to have total free access.
That's the significance of this statement.
But that's the point. I don't think actually fundamentally that has happened. And when Brexit negotiations actually happen and we start suffering genuine economic problems and turmoil and turbulence, and our position in Europe, which is weak. I mean, if you talk to
vast swathes of the continent, which is a reason a lot of people voted to leave the economic.
But if you talk to EU diplomats, they regard our country at the moment as a bit of a laughingstock. It's a very bad position.
They've got a vested interest in
saying. Great to have you both in talking around all of this. Thank you very much indeed, Joanne Nadler and Owen Jones. Thank you.
Now, Theresa May will return to work this week after a walking holiday on the continent. Her government is expected to publish more detail on the future of our relationship with Europe, including the UK's negotiating position on customs arrangements and on the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. The first future partnership paper is expected to be unveiled tomorrow. It comes after Sunday's joint letter between Philip Hammond and Liam Fox, in which they attempted to reassure businesses there will be no cliff edge after Britain leaves. Our reporter Diana Magnay is in Westminster. So, Diana, have they now agreed a plan?
Well, it's a plan of sorts, but it's still quite thin on detail. What they're saying is that they want Britain to be outside of the customs union and of the single market when we leave the EU in March 2019, but that there will be some kind of time-limited transitional arrangement to avoid any kind of cliff edge for business. Now, of course, the question is, what does this transitional arrangement look like? If we're outside the customs union, what kind of customs arrangements will be in place? And will the EU have to then negotiate two separate deals, a transitional deal and then the future shape of things to come? And how does it feel about that? Now, this was all meant to reassure businesses that there would be continuity post-Brexit, but we spoke to the Trades Union Congress earlier, who said that it really did anything but.
I think it's untenable to say that you can do a separate deal in the time we've got that preserves jobs, rights and livelihoods, that stops tariffs being imposed, that ensures that goods and services can travel around the European Union without restrictions. It's just impossible to do all of that in the time we've got left.
And Diana, what about that other big question, the border with Northern Ireland? What's happened on that?
Well, that's extremely problematic. Of course, at the moment, there is no border, thanks to a hard-fought peace process. And Theresa May has said in the past that she does not want to return to a hard border with customs posts post-Brexit. But how then to marry up what will be two competing customs regimes, UK and EU, and who defines the terms along that border? That's the big question. We spoke to Theresa Villiers earlier. She's a staunch Brexiteer. She's former Northern Ireland Secretary. She seemed to suggest that it would all be very easy. Let's take a listen.
It works in many parts of the world, and no doubt when the government publish their proposals over the next few days, we'll see more detail on that. But the TIR system for freight, electronic invoicing, in many countries, you see a very smooth transition across borders for goods using electronic means.
Big question, of course, is what Brussels is going to make of all of this, Carrie and Kathy, and talks are due to resume at the end of the month.
Diana, thank you very much.
The Prime Minister returns this week from her walking holiday in Europe, and her government is keen to show it's stealing the march on Brexit. Until now, the predominant features of this summer have been cabinet infighting and criticism over the speed at which they're getting on with the job. But tonight, a picture is starting to emerge of what Britain's negotiators will be pushing for in Brussels. Tomorrow, a future partnership paper will lay out the government's aspirations for one particularly thorny issue, the customs union, how we trade with our European neighbours. This isn't a formal negotiating position. That's still to come. But the plans suggest that the UK wants to put in place a temporary customs union during transitional period that we'll have after we leave the EU in March 2019. This is after the Chancellor and International Trade Secretaries wrote a joint article in the Sunday Telegraph making explicit that they want us out of the customs union the moment we leave the EU. We'll get full details of the government's proposals tomorrow. But our business editor, Helen Thomas, has been looking at what we know so far.
It's one of the big questions of Brexit. Will the UK stay part of the customs union? The agreement between European countries that allows goods to flow freely, tariff-free, between countries. Today, the first glimpse of a real answer from the government.
The government wants an interim period where we keep a close association with the customs union. That's good news for those fearing a hard cliff-edge Brexit, and it's meant to provide certainty to businesses. The government has also proposed two possible models for what happens in the future after that. The first is a streamlined customs system that uses technology and other agreements to remove as many barriers to trade as possible. The second is a new customs partnership, a bespoke arrangement that enables trade to carry on very much as it does at the moment.
Let's back up. A customs union is where a group of countries band together. In the EU's case, it agrees there will be no customs duties at borders between the states, so goods can be traded between those countries free of charge. But if goods are coming into the union from other countries, they are charged. Each is charged in the same way, no matter whether it's going into France, Greece, Italy, or any other country in the region. And, crucially, members are bound by the EU's common commercial policy, which means they're unable to strike their own trade deals with other countries. Philip Hammond and Liam Fox this weekend called for a time-limited interim period for transition, but stressed they were agreed that during this period the UK will be outside the single market and outside the customs union.
Well, on the latest proposals, there will indeed be a period of transition, and it will be time-limited. But what the government seems to be saying is that we would leave the customs union, only to move to a separate arrangement that's as similar to it as humanly possible. The big difference would be that the UK wants the right to start negotiating its own trade deals. Even if it doesn't sign them, that could be contentious. We'd be leaving the customs union only to stay as close to it as possible.
Firstly, there's a legal problem. So long as you are part of or close to the EU's customs union, the rules don't allow you to strike your own trade agreements. Secondly, there's a practical point. The other countries like America, Canada, New Zealand that might want to do deals with the UK don't actually want to negotiate them till they know what the UK's future relationship with the EU looks like. And they'll have to wait some time before they know the answer.
So what about those longer term options? If it's option one, which means border checks, At least governments and businesses will have had time to prepare. But option 2, a new type of customs partnership, could mean no disruptions at the borders at all. It all comes down to negotiation. Is the free flow of German cars and Italian Prosecco important enough for Michel Barnier to allow the UK to strike its own trade deals on the side? And will the UK be prepared to toe enough EU rules to make that happen?
Helen Thomas there. So the full details on this proposal will be released tomorrow. What we've had so far is just a preview, but there's certainly enough meat in it to discuss, and to do that is leading Brexiteer and Conservative MP John Redwood, and also the Labour MP Chris Leslie, who's a spokesperson for the campaign group Open Britain, which is campaigning against a so-called hard Brexit. Good evening to you. John, if I could start with you. It's slightly odd, isn't it, that Liam Fox and the Chancellor Philip Hammond got together at the weekend. They write this article in the Sunday Telegraph and they say they want us to be out of the customs union by the time we leave the European Union, March 2019. And then we're going to have this transitional period where basically we're in the customs union for we don't know how long. It's a mess.
Well, I don't think the second part is true. It's good news that the Chancellor and the Trade Secretary both agree with the government's policy, which has been a stated policy for some time, that we are leaving the single market and we are leaving the customs union. And that isn't just the government's wish, that is the fully expressed view of Parliament, because we had a very important vote on this in this recent Parliament, and we agreed that we will be leaving the single market and the customs union.
But this position paper shows that you're fudging it, because you're going to basically still be in a position where you want the UK to still be in the customs union in all but name. It's
well,
a
this
fudge.
is a discussion document with a couple of options on the more technical issues about how the customs clearances will work once we have left the customs union. And yes, of course, we would like something smooth and something similar to what we have at the moment. It's easier to replicate things that you've already got. But we will not be in the customs union, and we will be making our own trade agreements. And I would also say that we've got 19 months before we are likely to leave the European Union. And so instead of concentrating on a transitional arrangement afterwards, surely we should be maximising our use of those 19 months. And one of the good things about this paper is it is getting the media, and we hope the EU, to understand that we need to talk about trade now. Because if we use the 19, if we use the 19 months now,
it's all very well saying, yes, we're off, guys, but actually we'd quite like all of the same perks until we sort out what our next tranche of deals are. Well, some people would say they are, but if you just let me finish
helping Germany sell her cars to Britain.
Let me ask you the question: why on earth would Brussels consent to this?
Well, because they have much more interest than we do in terms of volume of trade and value of trade, and particularly value of trade that can attract tariffs under WTO rules. The main thing at risk is if we go out with no deal, which is perfectly feasible for Britain and be fine, is that there will be big tariffs on agricultural products. And
well, I don't think some people would agree it would be fine, including Chris Leslie.
Let me bring in. But the government's line is that no deal is better than a bad deal.
Well, that's what Theresa May was saying when she thought she could win a majority.
But just listen, let me explain.
Please let me bring in Chris Leslie.
The agricultural products are the things that can attract high tariffs, and they have a massive surplus in those, so I'm sure they won't want to do that.
You were right, that it is a complete mess, and we're going back to this land of wanting to have your cake and eat it.
Well, you must be happy then.
Well, maybe the penny is beginning to drop somewhere in Whitehall that actually this idea of leaving the customs union, maybe we can wait for the single market, we'd like to stay in that as well, is not really going to be that very good for our economy, for society, for prosperity at large. And the problem is that trying to sort of extricate Britain from 57 different trade deals that the EU have made over the last 40 years leaves Britain out in the cold because of Brexit,
so
with all of that to piece back, all of those jigsaw pieces to put back to pieces. How are you going to put those pieces back together?
They will novate to us under the international trade rules.
All of our no.
Do you see this, Chris Leslie, as a softening of the position then? We were thinking we were heading towards a so-called hard Brexit. If we're leaving the customs union but going for a deal that's exactly the same in all but name as the customs union, are you now hopeful this is a softer Brexit?
Well, I would love to hope it was something softer, and Philip Hammond seems to be trying to pull the government maybe in that direction. My worry is that there are so many obstacles now that have to be thought through properly. For instance, how is the UK going to get a fresh free trade agreement with the EU through all of those subnational and national parliaments all across the EU? For instance, all of those existing trade deals that we in the UK enjoy, how do we get those, as they call it, grandfathered, basically readopted for the UK? We're facing potentially a really serious problem.
Chris,
and the thing is, John, and the vote leave
all we do is
guys
agree
promised.
with the other countries.
You promised.
Well, we haven't heard from
in the referendum.
the other
Emma,
countries and the separate trade deals, not the EU countries.
in the referendum, John and Vote Leave promised that straight after the referendum, straight after the vote, from day one, we would be able to negotiate all these trade deals.
John Redwood,
that hasn't been happening.
Let me give you a preview. Tomorrow's papers are writing this up as a victory for the soft Brexiteers in the Cabinet, a victory for Philip Hammond, the Chancellor. Do you feel in any way, as an ardent Brexiteer, if I may call you that you've been sold down the river?
No, I don't agree with that analysis at all. The government policy is very clear that we leave the single market and the customs union. The 50-odd trade agreements that the EU has with the rest of the world will translate to us as well as the rest of the EU if both sides, that is the party in the foreign country and ourselves, want it to. It's nothing to do with the EU. It will be about us and the other country.
57 bilateral deals with all of the countries around the world.
And they will just be transferred to us.
When do you think those are going to happen?
Well, that's happening now.
Because it's not going to be March 2019
We are talking to the WTO now. We are a full member of the WTO, and as from...
Give us a date, then, when these are all going to be put in place.
Well, I've got a final question, if I can, John Redwood.
I see no reason why the trade should be interrupted at all.
Would you prefer Jacob Rees-Mogg to be doing this deal for you than Theresa May?
I'm very happy with Theresa May, and she is our leader, and Mr Rees-Mogg has made very clear he isn't running to be leader.
Well, Nigel Farage apparently has just tweeted that this is a betrayal of everybody who wanted to Brexit, but you're very happy with it, John Redwood.
Well, I think he is wrong on that. We are going to leave in March.
We're going to have to leave it.
Let's try and
we're going to leave the single market,
think about reversing the whole thing.
As we said.
It's
Weirdly,
not too late.
John Redwood's happy and Chris Leslie, you're also happy. So it's an unusual position.
But there's a reversal of the whole of the Brexit process. I think we could go still in that direction.
Thank you very much. Brexit's back on the agenda.
So this is what the future looks like after Brexit, an ambitious new customs arrangement with the EU, with the freest and most frictionless trade possible. That's according to the government in its key negotiating position published today. Sounds glorious, but of course Europe has to agree, and so far there's been a distinctly terse response. The EU's chief negotiator declared the trade wouldn't even be on the table before other major issues had been dealt with first, like the exit bill. Here's our political correspondent, Michael Crick.
This firm in Surrey makes gadgets for softening hard water. A quarter of their trade is with the European Union. But what they'd also like right now is some device to soften what they see as hard Brexit and the effects of Britain leaving the customs union.
Well, we're growing really quickly. Europe's a big market for us, and we want to continue that growth, and we see that by having, trade-free access into Europe. We want to have the same relationship with Europe that we've always had, or had recently. We want it to be as easy as selling in the UK.
Under the EU customs union, states trade freely with each other, without tariffs every time goods cross an internal border. But the EU does apply common tariffs to imports from the rest of the world. But after Brexit, how do Britain and the EU avoid sticking tariffs on each other's goods, as well as new red tape and other problems? Today's brief government report first of all suggests a new interim customs union after the 2019 Brexit date. It would last until 2022 at the very latest.
The interim period where we get to it, because it'll take a bit of time to get the structures in place, will be a bit like the customs union now, but it will be not the current customs union. We won't be a member of the single European Union, and we will want to go out and strike our trade deals, not bring them into effect, because that would give scope for sort of tunnelling into Europe, as it were, from outside. Wouldn't do that, but we see no reason why we will not be able to actually strike the deals during that period.
But could that temporary customs union actually work? And would the EU really let Britain strike new trade deals, as David Davis suggests? And would customs in the interim union be subject to EU law as now, and the European Court of Justice?
Well, you know, if these issues weren't so serious, you know, it would almost be laughable. You know, you've got the UK government appearing today to say they don't want to stay in the customs union, but they want to stay in a customs union that will be pretty much identical to the European customs union that we're in already. It's nonsensical and ridiculous, and you know, I think increasingly makes the UK government look like a bit of a laughingstock.
Well, what's wrong with an interim deal? It would only be a couple of years.
Oh yes, I mean, come on, you know.
Well, that's what Mr. Davis says. You don't believe him?
It took 9 months to trigger Article 50 for reasons I've never yet worked out. We're then told once it's triggered, just wait another 2 years, it'll all be fine. Now we're told, wait another 2 or 3 years, and I worry, you know, with the complete lack of vision that this government's got, that at the end of that 2 or 3 year period, we'll be told, well, we just need a few more years.
When the interim customs union did end, the report suggests, new IT might replace customs checks and cut queues at ports. Alternatively, a UK-EU customs border might actually be avoided through a partnership whereby Britain matched EU tariffs on imports from the rest of the world. That, though, the report admits, would be challenging and untested.
I'm pleased that the trade element is now at the front of the discussion with Europe. I know they've been trying to push back and sort about the divorce bill and all that kind of stuff. It's great that we are now pushing it further forward at the top of the agenda. I'm just concerned it's what we want, it's a starting position, and what are we going to trade away in order to get that?
European Commission sources said there was nothing new in this report, while the European Parliament's Brexit representative, Guy Verhofstadt, called it fantasy.
Well, Michael joins me now from Westminster. So, Michael, is this a victory for Philip Hammond and the soft Brexiteers? I'm a little bit confused.
Yes, indeed. Well, yes and no. I mean, Mr. Hammond has been making it clear for weeks that he wants some form of transitional arrangement, but he's now got that in terms of government policy at least. On the other hand, the hardline Brexiters have made it clear that we have to leave the customs union and the single market in March 2019. But it must be terribly confusing for members of the public when they see in the Sunday Telegraph Hammond and Liam Fox writing, as they did 2 days ago, we will leave the customs union, and then today David Davis saying, well, we want to join a customs union very similar to the existing customs union. But there is a significant difference between the customs union of the 28 states and a customs union between a single state and the EU. And the government believes that in the latter arrangement, an interim arrangement, that they will be allowed to negotiate trade deals with other states, although not implement them, although it's yet to be seen whether the EU will go along with that. I think there's a significant political development also today in that the government is acknowledging, I think, that it made a bit of a mistake in not publishing its position on many of these issues a lot earlier, and it's going to start doing that now, and also that it should have made its position clear on the long-term issues about our future relationship with Europe. And we're going to get a series of these papers over the next few weeks, including one on the border tomorrow.
Indeed. Well, we'll look forward to that. Michael, thank you very much. So how vulnerable is Britain to trade issues, and could the UK become the poor man of Europe? With me now, our business correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi. So tell us first, how robust is the UK economy then?
Well, the stars haven't really aligned for the UK economy, because rewind back to 2012 and you can see that UK growth was already at 2%. It goes all the way to 3.5%, but it slowed down. In the same time, German growth was rather more sluggish. It channeled along, but now it is doing much better than the UK. And the real turnaround story has been France. And at one point, we thought it was going into recession, and now it's picked up ahead of the UK. And the problem we have in this country is that the UK economy is driven by consumers. And at the moment, they're under pressure because of rising prices. Today, inflation came in again at 2.6%. And this is really squeezing household incomes at a time when wages are stagnating. And that's why trade is so important. But our exporters haven't done as well as hoped, despite the fact that sterling has fallen 20% since last year, since the referendum. Now, today's trade paper is trying to reassure companies, look, we're not going to fall off a cliff edge, But I caught up earlier today with a trade expert, Professor Jim Rollo, and he was rather more dubious, saying that a lot of this is dressing and a lot of detail has been left out.
It spends quite a lot of time being nice to Europeans, and that makes a change. It's better making friends with the people across the table if you want to get what you want. But they're still trying to treat it as a purely technical issue around customs procedures, and that leaves out a lot.
Do you think the government's doing a good job?
It's hard to be enthusiastic with things at the moment because the government's mainly looking over its shoulder at its own backbenchers.
There are particular complications with UK trade, aren't there?
We have very complicated goods, especially in manufacturing, so a lot of our exporters are also importers, unlike a country like Norway, which basically exports either fish or oil. We export things like cars, and the widgets from cars come across all Europe. So it's much more difficult and much more vital, therefore, that we do get access to the customs union.
I knew it was all about the widgets. Helia, thanks very much.
Thanks, Cathy. Well, a short time ago, I spoke to the Shadow International Trade Minister, Bill Esterson. I asked him for his opinion on the government's proposals regarding a transition phase.
We've got two options being proposed. One is a hard-edged Brexit, which must see increased costs and delays for business at the ports, and the other is this untested, untried, uncertain other option that the EU have already said have given short shrift. Look, this is about dealing with political problems in the Conservative Party, and it's not good news for business who need certainty and they need continuity.
Right. OK, well, let's get some certainty from you then. You don't like the Tories' ambiguity. Crystal clear, should this country stay in the customs union, yes or no?
It's not about the structure. This is about making sure that we have tariff-free access and that we don't have delays at the borders. The exact structure for that comes from negotiation. And the problem with what the Conservatives are doing is they're not even talking to our partners. We need to talk to our partners to get the best deal. Firstly, in a transitional phase, right, and then leading to the long term.
But it was a yes or no question. You didn't give me a yes or no answer. Yes or no to the customs union?
The point about anybody, I mean, I've run a business, and you know, when you're in business and you negotiate, you don't have a definite yes or no position. There are lots of things in life.
You're sounding as constructively ambiguous as the Tories.
No, I don't think so. Look, they're in government. They're the ones in charge of the negotiation. But if it was up to us, we'd be working much more closely with our partners in Europe. We've got to prioritise a trade deal with the EU to get the best for business. We've got to look after our existing relationships first. And this has got to be about
So this is the key question,
economy.
isn't it? Is trade with the EU more important than trade with the rest of the world? That's what it comes down to.
We have to start with what we've already got. 44% of our trade is with the EU. We've got to look after those trading relationships. That's why we need to have the existing arrangements.
So it's more important with the EU?
To be clear. Well, it could take 7 years, it could take longer to do new trade deals.
It sounds actually, if you're both saying exactly the same thing and you're both completely unclear about what the future will look like.
No, I don't accept that, because we've said that the transitional arrangement needs to take as long as is needed while we negotiate new arrangements with our partners. The government set a time-limited interim deal, and they put these two unworkable proposals on the table. I mean, yeah, the EU's given them short shrift today. It's clear they're not going to work, whichever one they go for. And frankly, after 5 months, we really should have seen something better from David Davis.
Bill Esterson there, the Shadow International Trade Secretary. Well, with me here is the Conservative MP Kwasi Kwarteng, and in Edinburgh, the Liberal Democrat leader, Vince Cable. Welcome to you both. Kwasi Kwarteng, let me start with you. So, as Michael Crick described rather pithily, on Sunday there was an article saying quite clearly by the government that we will not be in the customs union. Today, we are in a customs union. What's it going to be on Wednesday?
Well, there are two things here. There's obviously the customs union and when we leave that. And there's a debate at the moment as to the transition period, if there is one. And we're very clear that the end goal should be leaving both the customs union and the single market. That's been said, I think, initially by the Prime Minister in her Lancaster House speech in January. So that's always been very clear. And also, you will remember that during the campaign, the election campaign, it was a position of the Labour Party as well to leave the customs union. In fact, Barry Gardner, who is the shadow International Trade Secretary, has said quite clearly that he thinks the Labour Party, if it was in government, needs to leave the single market and the customs.
But if it's
that's a pretty unambiguous.
And if it's this
position.
clear, why is it taking you so long to come up with this paper? I mean, it would have been great to have this a few months ago.
Well, there was, as I said, there was the white paper, which was written on the back of the speech that the Prime Minister gave in January. We've had lots of forewarning of this. It's been very clear to me, anyway, and many others, where the position was. Labour Party, the leaders of the Labour Party are in very much the same place as we are. And I think it's a thing of the media. Maybe it's August. I don't know. But there's a
well, you've had a lot of squabbling in the cabinet.
There's a willful obfuscation about what the end goal will be.
But to be fair, you've been negotiating with each other more than you've been negotiating with Europe.
No, I think the negotiations with Europe have started as we would expect. Lots of wild words, perhaps, on their side. We're trying to be very clear about where we want to get to, and I think that we will eventually get there. We will leave the EU on amicable terms, I hope, and I think we can we can proceed favourably.
But it still sounds, certainly from the EU's point of view, as if you're still trying to have your cake and eat it.
Well, the negotiations have just started, so at the beginning of any negotiation, if you're trying to sell a house or sell a position, you try and get as much as you can. I mean, that's what people do at the beginning of negotiations. We'll just have to see how it evolves.
OK, let's turn to Vince Cable. Well, you heard Kwasi Kwarteng there. What's wrong with, well, trying to have your cake and eat it? What's wrong with trying to have the best possible trading relationship with the EU and then also stitch up a very good trading relationship with the rest of the world?
Well, that's where we are at the moment. We have a very good trade relationship with the European Union based on the customs union and the single market, and we have good relations with the rest of the world. There's nothing at the moment to stop us exporting more to China and India. We have preferential agreements through the European Union with, I think, about 60 countries, most of them former Commonwealth, but countries like Korea and pending Japan. We would lose all of that if we opted out of the customs union. That's why, unlike the Labour Party and the government, which are all over the place, we're very clear that it is absolutely in Britain's interest to remain within the customs union as well as the single market.
So the customs union, not a customs union?
Absolutely, but if you can fabricate a customs union that has exactly the same characteristics, we're just playing with semantics. But, you know, we're in a customs union. It works very well. It's particularly crucial for what you call the supply chain industries like cars and aerospace, which have lots of pieces moving backwards and forwards and which don't want to be interrupted by inspections around rules of origin. And once you disrupt that structure, great damage is done, particularly to manufacturing industry. That's why this nonsense really has to stop.
Now, you wrote an article, I think, for the New Statesman earlier this year, where you said basically why it's time to end free movement of people. Now, free movement of people is the price that we have to pay for staying in the single market. So where do you stand on that issue? Because you're in favour of the single market, aren't you?
Yes, I'm strongly in favour of the single market.
But not free movement of people.
The point I've always made is that within the single market, different countries interpret the rules in flexible ways. There are lots of examples, and I spent 5 years dealing with the Germans about trying to get them to agree to free movement of labour for professional staff, and they don't. I mean, that's something that's crucial to their national interest, so they have an exemption. But if we stayed fully committed to the European Union, it's possible to negotiate flexibly and sensibly. But the framework of the single market and its four freedoms are good principles, and they're things that actually Britain has been pressing for the last 30 years. It was a British idea. It didn't come from the European Commission.
But it sounds like you're on the same patisserie as the Tories. You also want to have your cake and eat it.
Well, I think we have a very good cake, which is the European Union, and we are eating it. So let's not rip it up and cause severe damage. We're in a good place, and leaving the European Union, leaving the single market, leaving the customs union are potentially very damaging.
Kwasi Kwarteng, he just made the point that, you know, we have a perfectly functioning customs union at the moment. Why replace it with another customs union?
I sat here last year. We had a lengthy debate. We had a 4-month campaign, and many of the issues that Vince raises were dealt with in that debate. We had an election, if you remember, a referendum, and the referendum decided, having heard all the arguments, the people decided to leave the EU. I think Vince is on a different planet, frankly, if he thinks that we're somehow going to stay in the EU and that people who voted leave will put up with that. We've moved on. It's very clear on the Labour side and also on the Conservative side that we're committed to leaving both the single market and the customs union for the reasons you described. Right. It's simply impossible to stay within the single market and have restrictions that people want on freedom of movement. That's what was told us last year.
OK, let me go to you again, Vince Cable. I mean, the problem, I guess, with the soft Brexit approach is that, you want to stay in the single market, you want to stay in the customs union, but you have none of the influence and you're still paying money into the EU. So, in a sense, it's a kind of bad version of what we had before. But we're not going to get what we had before back because we had a referendum.
Well, soft Brexit is worse than being members of the European Union, and hard Brexit is worse than soft Brexit. We've got a hierarchy of options. That's why some of us think that we shouldn't actually be leaving, and why we think that the public should be offered a choice when we say very clearly what the implications are. They weren't so clear during the referendum. I don't recall the customs union ever being discussed during the referendum, and I was in the middle of it. But once the options are clear, once we've seen what David Davis has negotiated, the public can then have a choice: either go ahead, jump off the cliff, or proceed a little bit more slowly off the cliff, or return to the arrangements we currently have. And I think the public should be given the option of changing their minds.
OK, I'm sure we'll carry on with the subject many, many times. Vince Cable, Kwasi Kwarteng, thanks very much.